Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jen Maxey, Chief Program Officer for Holocaust Museum LA. Welcome to our program today with author Jack Fairweather talking about his newest book, The Prosecutor. Jack will be joined in conversation today by renowned Holocaust scholar Michael Berenbaum. And if there's anyone today on our program who isn't familiar with our museum, we're the oldest Holocaust museum in the country, founded in 1961 by Holocaust survivors here in Los Angeles. And we hope you'll visit us at our home in Pan Pacific Park in the Fairfax area of Los Angeles, where we aim to educate about this history and inspire people to collectively envision a better world where othering, bigotry, and anti-Semitism find no place. It's going to take all of us, I think. In this book today, The Prosecutor, Jack Fairweather brings to life the remarkable story of Fritz Bauer, a gay Jewish judge from Stuttgart who survived the Nazis and made it his mission to force his countrymen and the world to confront their complicity in the genocide. And we're delighted to be working with Jack for the first time. So a little bit about Jack. In addition to being an award-winning author, Jack Fairweather was a freelance correspondent embedded with British troops during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where he was a stringer for the Daily Telegraph in Baghdad. And Jack's coverage of that war won him a British Press Award and an Overseas Press Club Award citation. His book, The Volunteer, a biography about Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who infiltrated Auschwitz during the Holocaust and the Second World War, won the 2019 Costa Book Award. Jack currently resides in Vermont, and so he's joining us today. Michael Berenbaum, in conversation with Jack today, is the director of the Ziggy Searing Institute and a distinguished professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. The author and editor of 24 books, he was also the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. And from 1988 until 93, he served as project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, overseeing its creation and later founded its research institute. So I think we're in very, very good company today when it comes to scholarship about the Holocaust. But before I get out of the way, I just want to remind everyone that our museum, Holocaust Museum LA, is undergoing a huge expansion, which will double the size of our museum by next spring. As such, we're closing the museum in early August to complete the construction, but we'll still have plenty of programs available. So check out our website and you can sign up to get our weekly e-blasts. So let's get to our program where Michael and Jack are going to speak for probably about maybe 45 minutes, take some of your questions, which you can put in the Q&A function. And we will also drop a link in so that you can purchase Jack's book from our friends here in Los Angeles at Book Soup. So Jack and Michael, take it away.
Jack, good afternoon and welcome to our program. Jack, you're muted.
Aha, good.
Okay.
So nice to be here, Michael.
And nice to be with you, Jack. Tell us a little bit about who Fritz Bauer is, or who Fritz Bauer was, and why he was so important, and shall we say also virtually unknown given his prominence.
Sure. Well, I'd like to answer that question, Mike. I'm just going to share a couple of slides and take a little bit of a step back to help set the scene. So I will share my screen with everyone. And I'd like to begin by asking everyone to imagine a history of the 20th century in which the Holocaust is only a footnote to the Second World War, and where the encyclopedia entry for Auschwitz describes the flourishing chemical industry in the nearby town, but omits reference to the gas chambers. School textbooks describe Hitler as gifted in a variety of ways and conclude that, quote, no more than a few hundred people knew about the mass murder. This isn't an abstract thought experiment, but West Germany in the years following Hitler's defeat, when the Holocaust was all but forgotten and the Allies sanctioned the return of millions of former Nazis to forge a new country as a bulwark against communism. It was time, in the words of the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, to quote, let bygones be bygones. And this is the world to which Fritz Bauer, the subject of my new book, The Prosecutor, arrived in 1949. So the scene I would like you to imagine is taking place spring 1949. And Bauer is sitting on a train entering Germany at the Danish border. He's 45 years old, a small man in a neatly tailored suit with a careworn look. He had once been the youngest judge in Germany and a rising progressive voice in the Weimar Republic. He was also gay, Jewish, and a committed socialist, and was extraordinarily lucky, as you can imagine, to survive the Nazis. Looking around at his fellow passengers, Bowers is wondering who among them had joined the crowds that greeted Hitler's motorcade, who had killed or watched others kill. For Bauer, these are pressing questions, not simply because of the dangers he faces returning to a war-torn country where many might still wish him harm. They're questions he has to ask because he is seeking justice. He's returning to Germany to become Attorney General in the city of Braunschweig. It's a provincial backwater, and he'll only have a small team of prosecutors. But he's watched the Allies impose their vision of justice on Germany, and he knows it's not gone far enough. Robert Jackson, the US chief prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, declared in 1945 that only Hitler and his inner circle should be considered responsible for the Nazis' crimes. 22 people were convicted the following year, and a few thousand more in follow-up trials and through denazification proceedings. The Allies believe that justice has been served, but Bauer is staggered by the number of perpetrators who've walked free. 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party. 250,000 had served in the SS that had operated death camps like Auschwitz. And yet most of these people simply slip back into German society and resume their lives as if nothing had happened. Bauer has got a radical idea that I think demands our attention today. He plans on using the justice system to force a national reckoning. By prosecuting Nazis in the courts, he hopes to hold their crimes up to scrutiny and in the process expose the roots of Nazism in German culture. Well, what are his chances of doing that? Well, one of Konrad Adenauer's first acts upon becoming chancellor in 1949 is to appoint as his chief of staff Hans Globke, who was a bureaucrat in the Interior Ministry of the Third Reich, had been one of the main implementers of the Nuremberg race laws that had stripped Jews of their rights and prepared the framework for their deportation and mass murder. Now Globke is one of the most powerful men in West Germany. His express purpose is to reintegrate former Nazis into society and draw a veil of silence over the past. Globke has at his disposal a spy network of former military officers and ex-SS men set up by the CIA to battle the Soviet Union, but which Globke is using to crush dissent and keep his crimes and those of others out of the courts. Somehow, Bauer is going to have to persuade a hostile court system stacked with Nazi-era judges to expose the past of others and convince an exhausted country to listen. And I think we take for granted Germany's role today as a bastion of Europe's liberal order and a country that we consider to have fully confronted its past. We also take our knowledge of the Holocaust for granted, in part through Michael's amazing work. To join Bauer on that train in 1949 is to realize that a very different future was possible. I spent the past 5 years researching and writing about Bauer for The Prosecutor. It's the story of how one extraordinarily brave man sought to bend the arc of history towards justice. It's also the story of how the Holocaust was finally established in our global conscience. I think coming across Bauer's story for the first time, you will be shocked, I'm sure as I was, at how long it took for the Holocaust to become part of our collective knowledge of the Second World War.
Jack, let me
Yes.
foreshadow a couple of things, and that we're going to talk about his incredibly important role in the arrest and ultimately the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann. And then we're going to talk about the Auschwitz trials, which really marked a transitional point in Germany and a transitional point in the world. And as a scholar who's written 2 books on Auschwitz, they also gave us a tremendous amount of information about Auschwitz and made Auschwitz, as it were, almost the symbol of the Holocaust itself. But let's begin way back. He's a promising young jurist, a judge. How does he escape Nazi Germany? Where does he go? What does he do? And he's actually twice potentially victimized, both as a Jew and as a gay man.
Right. He was really very lucky. The story of how he escapes is partly the misfortune in a way that he had of being one of the very first political prisoners to be arrested in March 1933, the very month that we describe as the Nazi ascent to power, when Hitler, as Chancellor of 2 months, begins to arrest all of his political opponents and impose a dictatorship on Germany. And Bauer was one of the very first to be arrested, and he was seen then as an opponent of Hitler because of his outspoken views. He had, as well as being a district judge, he had also been an activist for the Social Democratic Party, which is the main opposition to the German right, both to its conservative right, but also increasingly to the Nazis. And he had led protests and marches and spoken out against Hitler very bravely, and in distinction to so many of his colleagues in the judiciary who were of a conservative and right-wing bent. And
well, let's stress that for a moment. Number one, some of them agreed with Hitler, and many of them essentially kept quiet. Right. Acquiescence to the rule, to the autocratic rule, and ultimately the totalitarian rule of Hitler was part of what empowered him. Right. And if this echoes something in our world, then we should pay attention to it. Bauer was neither. He neither acquiesced nor was he silent. He was an active opponent. So he gets arrested in March of 1933. And take us further.
I think it's such a good point, Michael, that you to consider also that I think we have a very sort of day-glow version of the Weimar Republic from seeing, jazz bars and, and think of it as this, liberal panacea. It wasn't for Bauer, and for many activists, it was indeed the very place where the strands of German culture coalesced to give rise to Nazism. And so his experience even before the Nazis rose to power was one of discrimination and of threats and of being discriminated against for being Jewish.
And vulnerability because he was gay, and paragraph 175 could have gotten him in trouble from the very beginning.
Right. And so Germany had repressive anti-gay laws in place before the Nazis came to power. Of course, then the Nazis tightened them in due course and made it and added the threat of being deported to concentration camps. Bauer is sent to a sort of very early concentration camp called Heuberg, which is in the Swabian Alps to the south of Stuttgart. It's, a sort of makeshift former children colony. He is immediately subjected to a level of violence that is profoundly shocking for him and shocking for so many Germans. I mean, they did not know of concentration camps. This was something that happened in Russia, in the Gulag, something far away, or in South Africa during the Boer War. It was not something that Germans did to Germans. And, I was able to track down some of the testimony describing Bauer's treatment that was so traumatic for him that he almost never spoke of it after the war. It was something that he kept very, felt a lot of shame and about possibly because to get released from the camp, he was given an offer by the Nazis about 9 months in, after being subjected to hard labor, being beaten up regularly, terrible rations. They offered him a chance to leave the camp if he signed an oath of allegiance to the Nazis. And he and about a dozen other prisoners did do that and were released. And, I think one can imagine the sort of shame that he would have felt over doing such a thing. Also, he came under criticism from some of his social democratic colleagues for having done that. But of course, they weren't in, those that were criticizing him weren't in a concentration camp, and crucially weren't Jewish, because one of the things that Bauer witnessed in Heuberg was the death of the very first Jew in a concentration camp anywhere in Germany. It took place in the summer of 1933 by a prisoner in his being held in his very block. So, Bauer, I think we will have compassion for him with his decision to sign that oath. And it gave him a chance to leave the camp. And he spent the next 2 years living in this gathering police state in the years between 1933 and 35, having to report every week to the police station, constantly terrified of being rearrested. He, like every other Jewish lawyer, had lost their jobs, so he was unemployed and, beginning to fear the worst for what was happening to the country.
And then when did he leave Germany?
So he finally left in the spring of 1936, and that was to Copenhagen. And it was a fortunate time to leave. It was when it was still possible. The Nazis were still, to some extent, looking for German Jews to emigrate, and it was still possible to get asylum in places like Denmark. So he made the very difficult decision to leave behind his parents and join his sister and brother-in-law who had gone the year before to Copenhagen, and to try and rebuild his life. What for him must have felt like the long haul. He had no idea what was to come.
And where did he spend the war years?
So primarily in Copenhagen, as the people here today will know, the Nazis invaded Denmark in 1940, and he had to go on the run again within Denmark. He was arrested again by the Nazis through the Danish authorities, and held briefly in another concentration camp in Denmark. But Bauer, I think a real testimony to what just an amazing figure he was, is just, he built himself a life in a few short years. He built himself a life in Denmark. He learned Danish. He created this network of Danish social democrat friends and activists, and they learned that he'd been arrested again, and they managed to get the Danish authorities to make Bauer a ward of the state and remove him. And Denmark had this uneasy relationship with the occupying authorities, in which the Germans allowed the Danes to sort of rule the country to a certain extent, because they considered Danes to be northern Nordic types who were capable of some self-government. So Bauer got out. He still had to sort of live very uncomfortably until 1943, October, which was the Hitler ordered the roundup of all Danish Jews, and Bauer and his family and 7,000 other Jewish Jews had to flee from Denmark to Sweden in this extraordinary escape, which I hope one day features in a sort of vast epic film, because it was an amazing moment with these tiny little fishing boats over a week or two transferred so many people to safety.
We should say two things about the Danish rescue. Actually, three very brief things. Number one, it occurred late in October 1943. And that means that there already was the perception that the Germans might lose the war because it was after Stalingrad and after the Great Retreat. Uh, Secondly, the the major element of it was that the Swedes said that they were willing to accept Danish Jews, and geography played a very important role. There was a 9 mile across the Sound, essentially, between Denmark and Malmo in Sweden. And consequently, there was the opportunity for Danish Jews to escape. And then virtually the entire community came into activism. This was on Danish Sweden on Danish fisher boats, and in fact, there was an attempt to take many of the German boats out of the water for repair at this point. So Denmark, in that sense, plays a very important role. And the other moral thing that I always recall is Danes said we didn't do anything heroic. We merely protected our citizens against the hostile occupying power, not understanding that the respect of Jews as fellow citizens was already a moral change in the attitude throughout Europe. Right. So it was a very important point on Denmark. So he spent the war years then in Sweden. Did he get to Norway?
Michael, if I can just pause you for 1 second, I'd love to show everyone both a little bit of the research and also the very place that Bauer was rescued from during this great escape of his, because I was able to track down the family that sheltered him in a small fishing port called Røvig, and here are the granddaughters, and I'm sitting there. It's one of my sort of favorite moments in the research, or any type of research, where you get to sit down with maps and the family members and a local historian who, sort of began by saying, "Oh, we don't know anything about Bauer's escape," and then they remembered bit by bit little details their grandmother had told them about how the family was sheltered under the staircase because the German garrison was just 200 meters away. That the woman who sheltered them, Ingeborg Jonsson, was a widow and a mother of 5, so extraordinarily brave of her to house them. She managed to find them a local sea captain, and so with the 3 granddaughters, we set off on the route because they sort of remembered bit by bit what their grandmother had said about how they walked through this narrow pathway through the dunes near their house, and finally came to this beach. And this was where Bauer, his elderly parents, who he had finally gotten out of Stuttgart, his sister and brother-in-law and 2 little nephews waited for a fishing boat to come, and I found the only Second World War era fishing boat in Røvig to do a little recreation. So which I don't often do that level of recreation, but I think it was nice to be able to consider Bauer, who was to be this great figure in German history, tracking down Eichmann and the Auschwitz perpetrators. Think of him in a lonely moment.
Let's move ahead, Jack, and talk about Bauer's very unique and very important role in the capture of Adolf Eichmann. And also, by the way, his role, and listeners are going to be surprised, his role virtually in embarrassing the state of Israel into deciding to capture Eichmann.
So Bauer, he comes back to Germany, and he is, faced with this heavily unreformed society. There are literally former Nazis at every level of government. The courts are over half the courts are stacked with the very judges who had watched him getting arrested and acquiesced to Hitler's rise, but had also then implemented things like the Nuremberg race laws. And this wasn't simply, as I think some of those on the Zoom will think, of a question of Germany being indifferent or sort of being tired of war and wanting to move on. There was a real state policy of silence that was implemented from the top down and enforced by this CIA-backed group of former military officers and ex-SS men. So it really
And
showed.
the CIA essentially wanted to move German society so they were willing to fight the next war, which was then the Cold War. And
Exactly.
consequently, it was willing to overlook what they had done in the last war, as long as they were willing to fight the next war. So
Right,
he's in a den of former Nazis, all of whom have something to cover up.
right. And so at a certain point, um, he gets a file of Austrian war criminals that includes the name Adolf Eichmann. And Adolf Eichmann, his name had come up in the Nuremberg trials. In fact, he was used as a bit of a sort of someone who was broadly blamed because he had escaped at the end of the war and gone to ground, and none of the senior Nazis knew what had happened to him, and so he was sort of got some notoriety then. But essentially, if you had said to most people in Europe and the US, who is Adolf Eichmann, most people would not have known. And if you had said, what is Auschwitz? It's some might have known it as a concentration camp, but no one would have thought of it as
The sense
this in the way that we do today, and as this sort of symbol really of humanity's worse. And so,
as in the heart of the story.
very much at the heart of the story, along with Eichmann, of course, the man who brought so many to their deaths in the camp. And so, Bauer, he the Austrians are just seeking to hand off this case. No one in Germany wants to take on Eichmann's case. Bauer says, I'm going to take it. He saw the potential. Um, and this is one of the ways in which he's so brilliantly visionary when no one else did. He saw that Eichmann was a man to go after, but he had no idea where he was. Furthermore, he knew that the West German police was stacked with ex-SS men and Gestapo officers. And so to involve them in trying to search for Eichmann would have been tantamount to sort of handing any information he got over to Eichmann. He would almost certainly get tipped off by the West German authorities. So Bauer holds a press conference to say, I'm beginning this investigation. And this is just one of these extraordinary quirks of fate. In South America, in Buenos Aires, there is a blind Holocaust survivor who every morning has his teenage daughter, Sylvia, read him German language newspapers. And he had been in Dachau and partially lost his sight. And this was how he kept abreast of world events. And he was reading the German newspaper, and there was a small piece in it about Frankfurt prosecutor's office opens investigation into Eichmann. And the crazy thing is that for the past few months, Sylvia had been dating a teenage boy called Nick Eichmann, who had come home to meet her dad. And Nick Eichmann was a German. He didn't know that the family he was visiting was a Jewish one, and proceeded to tell them, "Oh, my dad was really big in Europe. We were traveling around the place. And such a shame that Hitler didn't get rid of all the Jews, and so on." And so that very moment that Sylvia's reading the newspaper article about Eichmann, her dad, Lothar Hermann, puts two and two together and thinks, "Oh my God, are you going out with Eichmann's son?" And he writes to Bauer. Bauer knows that he can't get the West German police involved, the Argentinian police involved. So instead, he begins this correspondence with this blind Holocaust survivor who, along with his daughter, begin the investigation into Eichmann. They're the ones who track him down. This teenage girl knocks on the door to Eichmann's house and confronts Adolf Eichmann and says to him, "Are you Nicholas's dad?" He was living under a pseudonym, of course, Eichmann, and at the time. But he says, "Yes, I am Nicholas's dad," and thereby confirmed his identity. And Bauer, of course, knew that he had now his man, but how do you get him to justice? Because he couldn't bring him to West Germany. Of that, he was certain. So he took a secret mission to see Mossad, and I think it's another one of the ways in which this, in approaching Bauer's story, you sort of realize a lot of the things you understood to be the case were a bit different, because I think the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, which, as you said, Michael, just this seminal moment, has been celebrated in film as this foundational moment for Israel, and of course, a great act of heroism by the Mossad agents involved. Of course, it was those things, but when you look at how Eichmann was found, you realize that, and that you learn that Bauer, when he presented Mossad with Eichmann, they weren't interested. They said, "We've got a lot on our hands at the moment.
They too, like the Americans, were worried about the next war not settling the last war.
Absolutely.
And the next war was against the Arab neighbors who were bent on their destruction. And the most they were interested in were the German scientists who had gone into the Arab world and were giving the Arabs a certain scientific advantage that could have been to detriment of Israel. So Absolutely. Bauer essentially, Bauer plays a double role. Number one, he understands very well German reality. And that is that if he goes too public with any information, you will have what? Tipping off where Eichmann is, and then Eichmann will go further underground. He also begins to understand how to manipulate the Israelis into taking some interest in this trial or in the possibility of capturing Eichmann.
And what he ultimately has to do is threaten the Israelis by saying, "I'm going to go public and say you're not doing anything to capture Eichmann. And that's going to mean Eichmann disappears, but you're going to be in a very awkward position if I, as West German chief prosecutor, say this."
Now, we have to also understand this is 1960. So this is 15 years after the end of the Holocaust. Israel's population is comprised of many, many Holocaust survivors. And it's also comprised of many people who had escaped the Holocaust by coming to what was then Palestine, but whose families were murdered. So the idea that Israel was not interested in capturing Eichmann would have been a deeply explosive political reality for the Israelis to handle. It would have been embarrassing, to put it mildly. And one can only think of the way in which Menachem Begin, who was then the opposition leader, would have used it to torment David Ben-Gurion and the Labor Party. So Bauer knows how to play this.
He does. In fact, there's an entry in David Ben-Gurion's diary after the Mossad chief comes to tell him about Bauer's ultimatum. Ben-Gurion says, "I think we better do this because ... He doesn't need to state how embarrassing this could be politically. And so then, of course, the story that we're more familiar with takes place. Eichmann is captured by Mossad. He's brought to Jerusalem, and that trial is every bit as impactful as Bauer had hoped. Hundreds of journalists attending the trial's opening. In fact, the very nature of Eichmann's arrest and the sort of the brazenness of the whole operation helped draw attention. But what it was that I think captured global interest in the Holocaust was, of course, the survivors whom were brought to testify. And I think it's worth adding, Michael, in this sort of sketch of what Israel was like in these years. I mean, it was, of course, hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, but it was also the case that even in Israel, the Holocaust was not spoken about. It wasn't commemorated in the way that it is today. Many Jewish leaders,
survivors were not respected. They
right,
were considered damaged goods. And the other thing, and it's remarkable the transformation that occurred in the Eichmann trial. Survivors were not respected, and they were sometimes considered sabonnikim, stopes. Why did
yep,
the Jews not fight? Why did they go, as it were, like sheep to the slaughter?
right.
And here, the decision of the Israeli prosecutor, which got bad press, at least from Hannah Arendt, was that he was going to use it not only to try Adolf Eichmann, but to present the narrative of the survivors, to the world. And this was the first time you had survivor testimony as a centerpiece. The other thing about this, I want to point out as we're going through this film, is that the Israeli courts understood the great interest in this internationally. So they didn't allow cameras in the courtroom, but they brilliantly built a separate room, soundproof room, behind the courtroom, in which they had cameras being able to capture the judges, the trial, the prosecutor, the defense victim, at the defense table, and they had one camera focused only on Adolf Eichmann the entire time. And this is before you have satellite imagery, you have satellite transmission. Every night they brought the film to the airport and they flew it on planes to Western Europe and to the United States. And they made it a public trial in a very real sense. And for Bauer, this was a tremendous vindication.
It absolutely was. And Mike, I just want to share that here we're seeing a Jewish Ukrainian woman called Rivka Yoselevska, who she testified on May the 8th, 1961. She'd been due to testify a week before, but she suffered a stroke at the prospect of testifying before Eichmann, and against doctors' orders, insisted that she would take the stand. And I think you can see in her face some of this raw emotion that came across and that really transfixed world attention. She's describing here how her 9-year-old daughter was shot before her, an entire family, and most of the ghetto from Pinsk in Belarus. Absolutely terrifying, horrific testimony to read about, and was really just this, her courage, the courage of all of these other survivors, as you say, speaking up at a time when they weren't respected or venerated in the way that we know today. And I think, I wanted to write about the trial and remind us of just how seminal it was. But there is a side to this trial that was completely new to me, and I think will be shocking to everyone on the Zoom today, and those who follow Bauer's story, because for Bauer, it wasn't enough to get Eichmann. He wanted to use Eichmann as a vehicle for attacking the former Nazis in the West German government, and in particular Hans Globke. There you see him on the right talking to
Sure.
Konrad Adenauer, and he wanted to try and get Eichmann to speak out about his work with Globke during the final solution. And so what took place was this extraordinary Cold War battle behind the trial that was waged between Globke and his CIA-backed West German intelligence service, and against Bauer and against anyone who would have the audacity to try and link his name to Eichmann. And it led to sort of things that shocking, were hidden from two German historians for decades after the fact. They've only just been declassified, many of these documents describing this West German attempt to silence Eichmann, or narrow at least what Eichmann could say, and at the same time intimidate Bauer. He came under threats. Adenauer told him he would risk being dragged off into the shadows if he continued to pursue Globke, and just a real testimony, I think, to Bauer's courage when you think about it. And if you think about it in our political day today, like, imagine a single prosecutor trying to take on, one of the most powerful men in the country and link him to this devastating crime.
And we should also say that the Germans put tremendous pressure on the Israelis that certain issues not be raised and that certain issues not be considered. Let's move ahead, Jack, because we are, again, you and I could talk for at great length and always with great interest. Take us through the trial, the second trial at the end of the 60s, the Auschwitz trials, and Bauer's absolutely pivotal role and his expectations from that.
So what Bauer realized from the Eichmann trial is that whilst it had been impactful in West Germany, many Germans had paid attention, observed it, learned about the Holocaust in all its detail for the first time, but it helped in some ways that Bauer hadn't anticipated to enforce this idea that only a few had been responsible for the Holocaust, because West Germans could say, oh, it was fanatics like Eichmann who were responsible. We didn't know anything. We were just going about our business. And, Bauer knew that wasn't true. He knew that there had to be a society-wide reckoning. And his idea for doing that was absolutely extraordinary. And that was essentially to put Auschwitz itself on trial by holding the largest criminal trial in West Germany's history, the largest Holocaust trial since Nuremberg, or the last trial featuring Holocaust information since Nuremberg, and put into the dock 22 defendants who had served in Auschwitz. And his vision was really extraordinary. He didn't want simply the people who had run the camp. What he wanted to show was how the camp had operated through ordinary Germans, the guards, the orderlies, the dentists, the doctors, and because he wanted West Germans to be confronted by themselves, essentially, in the dock. That question, I think, is at the heart of the book. And I think it's such an important one for us today to consider. How could ordinary people be enlisted in such crimes? In a way, how Eichmann could be enlisted was less interesting to Bauer because he was an ideologue. But what about the silent majority that had acquiesced? And he hoped that this trial would do that.
Let's go back philosophically for a moment, Jack. Remember, after the Eichmann trial, Hannah Arendt wrote a book called Report from Jerusalem on the Banality of Evil. And I always thought that she made a fundamental ethical and categorical mistake, which is that the evil was not banal, the evil was extraordinary. But the evildoer was what later Holocaust research, my friend Chris Browning would say, they were ordinary men.
Right.
And that meant that they were people like you and like me, and not particularly demonic sadists as we depict them. And that becomes deeply offensive to us as human beings, precisely because it's true. And that means that many people are capable of being put in the right situation, or the improper situation. Many people are capable of doing horrific evil. Take us through the slides and set the context for us.
So I just like to share the image of the opening day of the trial. Actually, Bauer is in the very back front row, and this is taking place in Frankfurt, in the city hall. The defendants are to the right behind those desks, and behind us, as the camera is looking, is this packed gallery again with all the reporters and who were sort of telling the story. And yeah, those 22 men were just these figures that actually really shocked and West Germans for the very reason that Bauer had hoped. So the man you see highlighted there in the background with the shades is Victor Capesius. He was, at the time of his arrest, a prosperous pharmacist in a small town called Göppingen, liked to take safaris to Africa, big game hunting, had a few lodges in the Alps, and very prosperous pillar of society. He was also the pharmacist of Auschwitz, who supplied gas to the gas chambers. And, he's one of these figures that, Bauer wanted to challenge West Germans with. The other thing he wanted to do, and I think it's a really extraordinary and sort of little heralded moment in the Cold War, was bring the trial itself to Auschwitz to confront not just the court delegation and the media, but the whole world with what Auschwitz was. Because a lot of the defendants, when they were in the dock, said the same denials as ever. Oh, we didn't see anything. We didn't, it was impossible to know what was happening in the camp. It was so big, and create this sort of haze of confusion about what took place there, a sort of fake news approach to their defense that we will be familiar with today. And what Bauer did was arrange the court to visit. And this image that is of the court delegation, which included 100 reporters, one of the judges and lawyers, and one of the defendants. This image is very familiar to us, that McBride Gate, but for so many people, seeing this on their front pages,
we have to say now familiar to us.
Yes, exactly.
But not familiar to us then. And it's precisely the visit to Auschwitz that played the transformational role emotionally, both for the judges and for the even for the not only the judges, but the prosecutors, the press, the German audience, and also in a very deep way, even for some of the defense lawyers. It played precisely the same role that the films of the concentration camps played in Nuremberg. It was the transitional moment.
Just showing images, Michael, of when the prosecution visited Birkenau, and those early images from the video were of the ruined gas chambers. That again, this was sort of news footage broadcast around the world that people were seeing for the first time. They had heard, I'm sure, of gas chambers. Many people, they hadn't actually seen them, hadn't been confronted with the actual place where that mass murder had happened. And the trial was a turning point in West Germany. Not, it should be said, for the defendants, or indeed, in many ways, for West German criminal justice, because many of the defendants actually got relatively light sentences. West German law didn't at that time recognize mass murder, crimes against humanity, as in its statute book. So it was only possible to sort of prosecute the defendants for murder if they could literally have been proven to have shot an individual person, which in the context of a death factory was, extraordinarily hard to do. Plus, it should be noted, the judge was a former Nazi era jurist who had overseen a lot of summary executions and had no interest in helping Bauer make his point. But what Bauer achieved through the trial, what his whole conception of justice, and I think this is really important for us today when we think about Bauer's legacy. He saw the trial as a way to speak past the courtroom itself, and in some ways even speak past the war generation that he understood probably might never sort of recognize their own crimes. He was speaking to the emerging generation that was coming up. And, there's a direct line between the Auschwitz trial and how the 68 generation sort of exploded in West Germany. Of course, it exploded everywhere in Europe
It
and the
exploded
States.
everywhere. This was in the United States. It was when the civil rights movement gave way to the anti-war movement. And in West Germany, it was absolutely explosive. In France, it was explosive. And also, it was the revolution that we saw in Czechoslovakia at that point. So it
Absolutely.
was very much the 60s generation. And Bauer was trying to speak to them and speak to what they had as, shall we say, a growing sense of justice and a growing sense of malaise in the war.
Absolutely. And I think what was unique, though, in the 68 sort of social revolution in West Germany was the way in which so many West German teenagers and young people started to confront their families and started to ask that question, what did you do? That had not been asked up until that point, and certainly not within families. And, that was part of that social change that fundamentally forced the country to look at some of the strains of authoritarianism, militarism, extreme conservatism that Bauer knew had to be examined if it was to be the case that the country wouldn't steer back towards Nazism. And that was in some ways his great, I presented in the book as his sort of great achievement following the Auschwitz trial, because that was in some ways the reckoning that he had so long sought and fought for 20
Yeah.
years.
Let me stress for the audience again, I am really of the 68 generation, meaning that we were in the prime of our youth, the prime of our college experience at that point. And we'd grown up in the United States with stories of what did you do, Dad, during the war? Now, my father, and the war was depicted in the United States as the war of good against evil, of the great American War, and we still call it the greatest generation. But that's a generation that fought that war from our side. In Germany, when you asked, what did you do, Dad, during the war? There was difficult conversations and very often dirty linen to bring out into the public. We also saw this a little bit later on in 1977 in Germany, or 1978 in Germany, when they had the docudrama The Holocaust played in Germany. All of a sudden, the phone lines exploded, the conversations exploded, the confrontations exploded. But Bauer tried to do it not through media, but through justice. And in that sense, had a major impact on Germany's consciousness of this. Take us through his final years, really, after this momentous trial.
Well, I think it's Bauer died in the summer of 1968, so he only got to glimpse a bit of this social revolution that he had been dreaming of. And I think it's worthwhile just reflecting on this extraordinary chap who I'm sure if you, for those of you who read the book, you will sort of, come to just admire and cherish Bauer for this very idiosyncratic personality in the courtroom, so charismatic, bombastic, angry, and dedicated. At home, he was a man who, was not able to ever live openly as a gay man. And that was a real struggle for him. It's worth noting that West Germany had almost all of its Nazi era laws stripped out of the statute books by the Allies, except those
with,
laws
with the
prosecuted.
exception of the major exception of paragraph 175.
Right.
And I believe it only got stripped out in 1969, if memory strikes me correctly.
Right, and then only partially. So, I mean, throughout Bauer's sort of mission, there hung over him this terrible, threat that, if he was ever exposed as a gay man, then he could face years. I mean, he'd lose his job for sure, and he would face years of hard labor. And so he had to sort of, balance his quest for love, his desire for intimacy and friendship, with his mission, and that's like the sacrifice that I think will really, is really inspiring for us today to consider what it took to make West Germany confront its past, and that's embodied in those sacrifices.
Well, let me first of all thank you, Jack. Let me also recommend very highly the book, The Prosecutor. I want you to know that when I was I brought the book over to Israel, and when I was in Israel, I gave it to a man by the name of Ephraim Zuroff, who's one of the last of the Nazi hunters, and he expressed enormous gratitude. I came home and I bought it again because I want it, along with your other book, on my library shelf, because I think it's a beautifully written, brilliantly presented, marvelously researched work. And we thank you for that. And we thank you for bringing Fritz Bauer out of obscurity into a deeper appreciation of his unique role and what he contributed to Holocaust memory. So thank you very much on behalf of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. We thank you for joining us, and please pay attention to their future programming. Thank you.